George Washington's reluctant rise to power was marked by a profound sense of duty that ran deeper than any desire for personal fame or glory. His life had been shaped by the turbulent events of the American Revolution, yet his ascent to the presidency was not one he sought, but rather one that found him. Born into a relatively modest Virginia family, Washington had witnessed firsthand the complexities of colonial life and the struggle for control over a land that was rapidly being transformed by both internal tensions and external forces. By the time the colonies rebelled against Great Britain, Washington had already earned a reputation for his military acumen, his dignity, and his unwavering sense of honor. At the heart of Washington's character was a man who understood the weight of responsibility. His leadership during the French and Indian War had been marked by early failures, but also by an unyielding determination that won him the respect of his peers. Despite his relative youth, Washington's military career shaped his understanding of the delicate balance between authority and compassion, between control and restraint. This balance was crucial during the Revolution, as he took command of the Continental Army in 1775, a time when the fledgling nation was in a perilous state. The war was long and grueling, and Washington's leadership was pivotal not just in strategy, but in his ability to inspire and unite a deeply divided and often disorganized army. But it wasn't just military strategy that shaped Washington's rise. It was the indomitable resolve to preserve a nation in its nascent stages. The Revolution left behind not only scars of war, but also an unsettled political landscape. In 1783, when the war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, Washington had become a national hero, admired and revered not just for his military triumphs, but for his steadfast commitment to the principles of liberty and independence. Yet despite his fame, Washington was disillusioned with the disarray of the post-revolutionary period. The Articles of Confederation, which governed the United States, proved ineffective in uniting the nation. The economy was in shambles, and there was little sense of cohesion between the states. Washington, ever the realist, could see that the fragile experiment in democracy was teetering on the edge of collapse. It was in this environment that the call for Washington's leadership grew louder. In the aftermath of the war, Washington had retired to his beloved Mount Vernon, a place of quiet reflection and respite. He was deeply connected to the land. In his life, there had always been a source of solace after years of warfare. But the nation was fracturing under the weight of its own disorganization, and the vision of a unified republic seemed increasingly distant. Political infighting, economic instability, and the lack of a coherent national vision had many wondering whether the experiment in republicanism would survive. It was during the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that Washington's name re-emerged with newfound urgency. As debates raged over how to form a stronger, more effective government, there was a consensus among many of the nation's leading figures that Washington was the only person capable of leading the country through this precarious moment. There was a collective recognition that only Washington possessed the integrity, the stature, and the moral authority to guide the fledgling republic through its formative years. His role in the military had already proven his ability to navigate difficult circumstances, but now the challenge was political. The stakes were higher than ever before. Despite the overwhelming call for him to assume the presidency, Washington did not seek the office. In fact, he was deeply hesitant about returning to public life. Washington's reluctance to embrace the presidency was rooted in several factors, not least of which was his profound understanding of the potential dangers of concentrated power. He had seen firsthand how monarchies and despots could abuse power, and he was committed to ensuring that the United States would not fall victim to the same fate. He had fought for independence precisely to avoid the very tyranny he had once suffered under British rule. The presidency, to Washington, represented a precarious power, one that could easily slip into autocracy if not handled with the utmost care and restraint. Washington's reluctance, however, did not go unnoticed. In his absence, the sense of national unity had eroded further, and a deepening sense of crisis emerged. The Annapolis Convention of 1786 had laid bare the need for a stronger federal structure, and Washington's participation in the Constitutional Convention had become seen as essential for the success of the proceedings. But it was his personal integrity, his sense of duty to the country, that ultimately compelled him to take the oath of office. After much persuasion from his peers, including James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, Washington reluctantly agreed to become the first president of the United States. It was a decision rooted not in ambition, but in an unwavering sense of responsibility to the nation. In his mind, the presidency was a sacred trust. He was acutely aware that the eyes of the world were upon him, and that the future of the United States rested on his decisions. As he took office in 1789, Washington's initial actions as president reflected his deep respect for the rule of law and his belief in the power of democratic institutions. His first steps in office were not to consolidate power, but to establish a framework for future leaders. He was not interested in ruling as a king, but rather in guiding the nation toward a system of government that would endure long after he was gone. One of Washington's most important early decisions was to create a cabinet, a move that was unprecedented in American politics at the time. He carefully selected men who could provide expert advice on matters ranging from foreign policy to finance, recognizing that no one person could bear the weight of governance alone. His choices were both strategic and pragmatic, bringing together men like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox, each of whom would play a pivotal role in shaping the nation's future. The establishment of the cabinet was not merely an administrative decision. It symbolized Washington's vision for the presidency as one of collaboration, not domination. He was determined to avoid the mistakes of monarchical rule, and by creating a group of trusted advisors, Washington sought to ensure that decisions would be made through careful deliberation rather than autocratic decree. His humility in this process was notable. He did not seek to dominate his advisors, but to listen and act according to the collective wisdom they provided. Washington's willingness to share power, to surround himself with differing viewpoints, became one of the defining characteristics of his presidency. But it was not just his actions that defined his presidency. It was the emotional weight of his position. Every decision he made, every direction he set, was done with the knowledge that he was setting a precedent for all future leaders. There was no roadmap for him to follow, no guidebook on how to navigate the turbulent waters of American politics. Washington's leadership was a balancing act between maintaining order and nurturing the fledgling democratic principles that had inspired the revolution. And although his leadership was admired, it was also fraught with tension. The nation was deeply divided, and the path ahead was uncertain. Washington's decision to take on the presidency was not a matter of personal ambition. It was a call to duty that transcended his own desires. His reluctance was rooted in his understanding of the gravity of the task at hand, and his deep respect for the delicate balance of power required to sustain a new nation. As he assumed office, Washington's first steps were to ensure that the United States could navigate the dangers of its infancy and secure its future as a republic. He did not seek power for its own sake, but rather he sought to safeguard the values upon which the nation had been built. When George Washington took office as the first president of the United States, he inherited not just a new nation, but a fragile and unstable republic. The American Revolution had secured independence from Great Britain, but it had also left behind a host of unresolved issues that threatened to undo the very fabric of the new country. The Articles of Confederation, which served as the nation's first constitution, had proven ineffective in holding the states together. The economy was in disarray, with debts piling up and no central authority to manage trade or taxation. The states were fractured with their own competing interests, and the question of how to unite them under a single government was a daunting one. Washington, aware of the stakes, knew that his leadership would be crucial in navigating these turbulent waters. The first years of Washington's presidency were marked by a profound sense of uncertainty. There was no established precedent for a president, no clear understanding of the role or how far its power should extend. The Founding Fathers had designed the presidency as a part of a broader system of checks and balances, but the precise limits of executive authority were still unclear. Washington, though reluctant to take on the mantle of power, understood that he would be setting the course for future presidents. His actions in the early days of his presidency would establish the foundation upon which the United States government would rest for generations to come. In this atmosphere of ambiguity and division, Washington's first challenge was to restore order. He quickly realized that the nation needed a strong, centralized government capable of managing the affairs of the states and protecting the nation from both internal and external threats. The Confederation government had been weak, unable to enforce laws or regulate trade, and the country was plagued by economic instability. Without the power to tax or regulate commerce, the Confederation Congress had been virtually powerless in addressing the nation's financial crisis. This lack of central authority made it difficult for the new nation to respond effectively to challenges, both from abroad and within its own borders. Washington knew that the road ahead would not be easy. One of the first issues he faced was the question of how to handle the nation's debt. The United States owed millions of dollars to foreign governments, private citizens, and soldiers who had fought in the Revolution. Without the ability to levy taxes, the government had no way to repay these debts, and the financial system was in danger of collapse. Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant but contentious figure, as his Secretary of the Treasury, tasking him with finding a solution to the nation's economic crisis. Hamilton's approach was bold and controversial. He proposed the creation of a national bank, a centralized institution that could issue currency, regulate credit, and manage the nation's debt. He also advocated for the federal government to assume the debts of the individual states, a move that would strengthen the central government's authority and help unify the nation. Hamilton's vision was one of a strong, centralized government that could shape the future of the country's economy and foreign policy. But his ideas were met with fierce opposition, particularly from Thomas Jefferson, who believed that the federal government should remain weak and that power should be distributed more evenly among the states. Jefferson saw Hamilton's plan as a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a few, and he feared that it would lead to the erosion of the democratic principles that had been the foundation of the Revolution. The debate between Hamilton and Jefferson over the future direction of the country would define much of Washington's presidency. Washington, for his part, was caught in the middle. He admired Hamilton's vision for a strong national government, but he also understood Jefferson's concerns about the potential for tyranny. Ultimately, Washington sided with Hamilton, believing that a strong national government was essential for the survival of the republic. He also recognized that the country needed to stabilize its finances if it was to have any hope of surviving as a unified nation. Hamilton's plan to assume state debts and create a national bank was approved by Congress, marking a significant step toward the creation of a strong federal system. Yet, even as Washington sought to stabilize the nation's finances, he faced a growing sense of division within the country. The rise of political parties was one of the most significant challenges of the early republic. Though Washington himself was deeply wary of political factions, he could not ignore the reality that the country was beginning to divide into two distinct groups: the Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. These two factions represented different visions for the future of the United States, and their rivalry would shape American politics for years to come. The Federalists, who supported a strong central government, believed that the United States needed to have a powerful federal system in order to compete with European powers and maintain domestic order. Hamilton, in particular, saw the need for a national bank, a standing army, and a strong centralized government that could regulate commerce and taxation. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, championed a more decentralized government. They feared that a powerful federal government would infringe on the rights of the states and the individual, and they favored agricultural policies over industrialization. Washington was not immune to the tensions between these factions, but he remained resolute in his belief that unity was essential for the nation's survival. He often found himself walking a fine line between the two factions, trying to preserve the fragile peace while navigating the growing political divisions. His decision to side with Hamilton on the question of national debt and a national bank was one of the first major steps in the development of the Federalist Party, and it would have lasting consequences for the country. As the political climate grew more polarized, Washington became increasingly concerned about the rise of political parties. He believed that parties would only serve to divide the nation and undermine the ideals of the Revolution. In his farewell address, Washington would famously warn against the dangers of political parties, urging Americans to avoid entangling alliances and factionalism. His concerns about political division were well-founded, as the nation's first political parties became entrenched and bitterly opposed to one another. Another challenge that Washington faced in the early years of his presidency was the question of foreign policy. The United States, newly independent and fragile, found itself caught between two powerful European nations, Great Britain and France. Both countries had been involved in the American Revolution, but their interests in the new republic were not aligned. Washington sought to maintain neutrality, recognizing that the United States was too weak to engage in any military conflicts with either power. But neutrality was a difficult line to walk, and Washington's foreign policy decisions were frequently tested by the competing interests of European powers. One of Washington's first major foreign policy decisions was to issue the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, declaring that the United States would not take sides in the conflict between Britain and France. This decision was controversial, especially among those who favored France, which had been an ally during the Revolution. But Washington's decision was grounded in the belief that the United States needed time to solidify its position and strength before becoming entangled in European conflicts. The Neutrality Proclamation was a significant step in shaping the foreign policy of the United States, establishing a precedent for the nation's approach to international relations for years to come. Despite his best efforts to maintain peace, Washington's presidency was marked by increasing domestic unrest. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion broke out in western Pennsylvania as farmers protested a federal tax on whiskey. The rebellion was a direct challenge to the authority of the new federal government, and Washington responded with force, sending a militia to quell the uprising. The suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated Washington's commitment to maintaining law and order, but it also highlighted the tensions between the federal government and the western frontier. Through it all, Washington remained committed to the vision of a unified and stable republic. He understood that the road to nationhood would be long and difficult, and that the challenges he faced as president were not just political, but deeply emotional. His decision to take on the mantle of leadership had been made out of a sense of duty, and as he navigated the complexities of early American governance, he continued to face the weight of responsibility that came with the office. Despite the divisions, the economic challenges, the foreign threats, and the rising political factions, Washington understood that his actions would have a lasting impact on the future of the United States. As George Washington entered the second year of his presidency, the nation found itself grappling with questions about the very nature of power and governance. The young republic had emerged victorious from the Revolutionary War, yet its future was far from secure. The Articles of Confederation, the fledgling system of government that had guided the country through its war for independence, proved to be weak and insufficient for governing a growing nation. Washington's leadership was essential, but it was also precarious, as he faced internal conflicts, external pressures, and a fragile sense of unity. The political factions that had started to form during the drafting of the Constitution were now becoming more pronounced, and the lines between them were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. From the beginning of his presidency, Washington had been acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. While the Revolution had secured American independence from Britain, it had also left the country deeply divided and uncertain about its future direction. The question of how to create a functioning government that balanced the need for a strong central authority with the desire for individual freedoms and state rights was an ongoing source of contention. Washington had inherited this challenge, and he knew that his actions, more than any political ideology, would shape the future of the United States. In the early days of his presidency, Washington focused on stabilizing the economy. His administration inherited a nation burdened with significant war debt and an inefficient financial system. With no strong central government to manage fiscal policy or enforce laws, the country was on the brink of financial ruin. The situation demanded decisive action, and Washington turned to his trusted advisor, Alexander Hamilton, to provide solutions. Hamilton, who had played a critical role in drafting the Constitution, believed that a strong central government and a robust national economy were essential to the survival of the United States. His vision was one of a powerful federal government that could manage the country's debt, regulate commerce, and maintain a strong military. To achieve this vision, Hamilton pushed for the establishment of a national bank, a strong central banking system that would help stabilize the country's finances. The debate over Hamilton's financial plan soon revealed the deepening divisions within the American political landscape. Hamilton's proposal to create a national bank was vehemently opposed by Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State and a key leader of the opposition. Jefferson, who favored a more decentralized government and a strict interpretation of the Constitution, argued that the establishment of a national bank was unconstitutional. He believed that the power to create such an institution was not expressly granted to the federal government by the Constitution, and therefore, it should be left to the states. Jefferson's opposition to the bank was rooted in his belief that a strong central government would eventually trample on the rights of the states and individuals. In contrast, Hamilton argued that the Constitution's necessary and proper clause gave the federal government the authority to create institutions like a national bank in order to carry out its enumerated powers. He contended that a national bank was essential for managing the country's war debt, regulating currency, and fostering economic growth. Hamilton believed that a strong federal government would provide stability and order, and that the new nation's future depended on the ability to manage its financial affairs. The divide between Hamilton and Jefferson was not just ideological. It was also deeply personal. The two men had very different visions for the future of the United States, and their rivalry would shape the early years of the Republic. As Washington navigated these conflicting visions, he found himself torn between the two men. He admired Hamilton's pragmatism and his ability to think beyond the immediate crisis to secure the nation's long-term future. At the same time, Washington respected Jefferson's commitment to liberty and his belief in the importance of limiting federal power. For Washington, the issue was not just about constitutional interpretation, but also about the survival of the new nation. He knew that if the federal government was to function, it needed to be able to manage its debt and raise revenue. But he also understood that too much power concentrated in a single institution could threaten the Republican principles on which the country was founded. Washington's decision to side with Hamilton on the issue of the national bank marked a significant turning point in his presidency. In doing so, he set a precedent for executive decision-making that would shape the future of the office. His endorsement of Hamilton's financial plan was not a simple matter of supporting one policy over another. It was a recognition of the need for strong central authority in order to secure the nation's future. Washington's decision was also a reflection of his broader philosophy of governance, one that sought to balance competing interests while maintaining order and stability. However, the creation of the national bank was not the end of the debate over federal power. As Washington and his advisors wrestled with the question of how to stabilize the economy, they also had to confront the issue of foreign policy. The young United States was still trying to find its place in a world dominated by European powers, and Washington was determined to keep the nation out of the conflicts that were consuming Europe. France, still recovering from its revolution, sought to draw the United States into an alliance, while Britain, with whom the U.S. had fought the Revolutionary War, remained a major economic and military power. Washington's task was to navigate these competing interests while preserving the nation's independence. The issue came to a head in 1793 when the war between France and Britain broke out. Washington was faced with the difficult decision of whether to honor the 1778 treaty with France, which obligated the United States to come to France's aid, or to remain neutral. Hamilton, ever the pragmatist, believed that aligning with Britain would be in the United States' best interest, while Jefferson, ever the idealist, felt a moral obligation to support France. Washington, recognizing the dangers of becoming entangled in foreign conflicts, chose a path of neutrality. His proclamation of neutrality, issued in April 1793, declared that the United States would not take sides in the war between France and Britain. This decision was controversial, especially among those who had supported France during the Revolution, but it was ultimately the right one for the nation's long-term survival. Washington's decision to remain neutral in foreign conflicts was a defining moment in his presidency. It set a precedent for future American foreign policy, one that emphasized avoiding entangling alliances and focusing on the nation's own interests. Washington's neutrality was not just a policy. It was a statement of America's desire to be free from the influence of foreign powers and a focus on its own development. The proclamation of neutrality helped solidify Washington's position as a leader who prioritized the long-term welfare of the nation over short-term political gains. While Washington's decision to pursue neutrality in foreign affairs was widely praised, it did not prevent internal tensions from growing. The rise of political factions continued to divide the country, and the influence of Hamilton and Jefferson only intensified. The differences between the two men were not just about policy. They represented competing visions for the future of the United States. Hamilton's vision of a strong central government, a national bank, and a robust military stood in stark contrast to Jefferson's belief in a decentralized republic, with power resting in the hands of the states and the people. As these political divisions deepened, Washington became increasingly concerned about the impact of factionalism on the future of the nation. He had always been wary of political parties, believing that they would divide the country and undermine the principles of the Revolution. In his farewell address, he would famously warn against the dangers of political parties, urging Americans to avoid factions that would tear the nation apart. Washington's concerns were not without merit. The partisan divide between Hamilton and Jefferson would continue to shape American politics for decades to come. Despite the growing divisions, Washington's leadership remained crucial in maintaining order and stability during the early years of the Republic. His ability to navigate the tensions between Hamilton and Jefferson, as well as his decision to remain neutral in foreign affairs, helped to secure the nation's future. Washington's presidency was defined by his commitment to preserving the unity of the United States, even as he grappled with the complex issues of governance, economic stability, and foreign policy. His actions laid the foundation for the nation's future and established the principles of leadership that would guide future presidents. As George Washington settled into the rhythms of his presidency, the enormity of the task he faced began to unfold in increasingly complex ways. The fledgling United States, though free from British rule, was still a deeply fragmented and unstable collection of states. The victory in the Revolutionary War had achieved independence, but it had not automatically created unity or a cohesive identity. The country was suffering from an economic crisis, political fragmentation, and an absence of a coherent national direction. Washington's central challenge was clear: how to turn the fledgling republic into a functioning government while maintaining the delicate balance between federal and state power. This challenge was not just political, but also deeply emotional, as Washington understood that his leadership would determine whether or not the United States could survive its early years. One of Washington's most pressing concerns was the creation of a working, effective government. The Articles of Confederation, the first governing framework for the nation, had proven to be insufficient. While the Articles had held the states together during the Revolution, they lacked the authority to regulate trade, levy taxes, or enforce laws effectively. The central government was weak, and as a result, the states often acted independently of one another with little regard for the broader needs of the nation. The lack of a national economic policy, combined with growing unrest over debt, trade imbalances, and unpaid soldier pensions, had made it clear that a stronger federal government was necessary. Washington was well aware of the importance of laying a firm foundation for the new government. The first order of business was establishing key institutions that would provide stability. The creation of a national financial system was at the top of the list. To address the nation's mounting debts, Washington turned to Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, who had a bold vision for the future of the country's financial system. Hamilton proposed a series of measures to stabilize the economy, including the establishment of a national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, and the creation of a system for managing national revenue and credit. His vision was one of a strong central government capable of managing the nation's financial affairs, and he believed that such measures were necessary to provide the country with economic stability and the ability to compete with foreign powers. Hamilton's financial plan was met with considerable opposition, particularly from Thomas Jefferson and his allies, who feared the concentration of power in the federal government. Jefferson, who served as Secretary of State, was a staunch advocate of states' rights and believed that a strong central government would lead to the erosion of individual liberties. Jefferson argued that Hamilton's proposals, particularly the creation of a national bank, were unconstitutional, as the Constitution did not explicitly grant the federal government the power to create such an institution. Hamilton, on the other hand, contended that the Constitution's necessary and proper clause gave the federal government the authority to take actions that were not explicitly enumerated but were necessary to carry out its duties. The debate between Hamilton and Jefferson was not just a disagreement over policy. It was a clash of two fundamentally different visions for the future of the United States. Hamilton's vision was one of a strong, centralized government with the power to regulate the economy, establish a national bank, and maintain a standing army. Jefferson's vision was one of limited federal power, with a focus on agrarianism and the rights of the states. The division between these two men would eventually crystallize into the formation of the first political parties in American history, with Hamilton leading the Federalist Party and Jefferson leading the Democratic-Republican Party. Despite the opposition, Washington ultimately sided with Hamilton, recognizing the need for a strong central government to address the country's immediate challenges. Washington's decision to back Hamilton's financial plan was a crucial moment in the early years of the Republic. It was a decision that would have lasting consequences for the balance of power between the federal government and the states, and it was also a statement of Washington's belief in the importance of national unity and stability. While Washington worked to establish a functional government, he was also deeply concerned about the potential for political factions to undermine the country's fragile unity. Washington had always been wary of political parties, believing that they would divide the nation and create unnecessary conflicts. In his farewell address, he would famously warn against the dangers of political parties, arguing that they would lead to division and strife. But in the early years of his presidency, the rise of factions was inevitable. The divide between Hamilton and Jefferson was not just ideological, it was deeply personal. Both men were brilliant and passionate in their beliefs, and their rivalry would shape the direction of the country for years to come. The emergence of political factions was also compounded by the growing influence of the press. Newspapers, many of which were aligned with either Hamilton's Federalists or Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, began to play an increasingly important role in shaping public opinion. The press became a battleground for competing political ideologies, and the newspapers of the time were often filled with vitriolic attacks and sharp criticisms of political leaders. Washington, who had spent much of his life avoiding the public eye, found himself thrust into the center of this political storm. He understood that, as the first president, every decision he made would be scrutinized, and he was acutely aware of the importance of preserving national unity and stability. As Washington worked to stabilize the nation's economy and create a functional government, he also faced the question of foreign policy. The United States, though independent, was still vulnerable to the pressures of European powers, particularly Britain and France. Both nations had interests in the new republic, and Washington was keenly aware that the United States needed to navigate the complexities of international diplomacy with caution. The question of whether to align with France or Britain became a key issue during Washington's presidency, and it exposed the growing divide between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton, ever the pragmatist, believed that the United States should align itself with Britain, a nation with which the U.S. had significant economic ties. Jefferson, on the other hand, believed that the United States should support France, which had been an ally during the Revolutionary War. The United States' relationship with France was complicated, however, as France was embroiled in its own revolution, and Washington was wary of becoming entangled in European conflicts. Washington's decision, ultimately, was to pursue a policy of neutrality, which he formalized in the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. The proclamation declared that the United States would not take sides in the conflict between Britain and France, a decision that was controversial but ultimately in the best interests of the young republic. The decision to remain neutral in foreign affairs marked a significant turning point in Washington's presidency. It was a decision grounded in realism, as Washington understood that the United States was not yet strong enough to engage in European conflicts. By pursuing neutrality, Washington sought to protect the nation's independence and focus on domestic concerns. At the same time, he recognized that the U.S. could not afford to ignore international relations entirely. Washington's neutrality, therefore, was not a rejection of foreign alliances altogether, but a strategic decision to avoid unnecessary entanglements until the nation was stronger and more secure. As Washington continued to navigate the challenges of governing a young and fragile nation, he remained deeply committed to the principles of republicanism and democracy. He believed that the success of the United States depended on the ability of its citizens to govern themselves, and he understood that the role of government was to preserve liberty and maintain order. The balance between these two ideals, freedom and stability, was one of the central themes of his presidency. Washington's leadership was not about personal ambition or power, but about securing the future of the republic. Through it all, Washington's personal character remained a steady anchor for the nation. His dignity, restraint, and sense of duty made him a symbol of unity and stability in a time of uncertainty. He did not seek the presidency out of a desire for power, but because he believed it was his duty to lead the country through its formative years. His decisions were guided by a deep sense of responsibility to the nation and its people, and he was willing to make difficult choices in order to secure the future of the republic. As Washington laid the foundation for the United States, he understood that the course he set would affect generations to come. His leadership, grounded in humility and a commitment to the ideals of the Revolution, would help ensure that the United States would not only survive but thrive in the years to come. As George Washington's presidency moved into its third year, the sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on him began to grow even more pronounced. The fledgling nation had made strides, but it was still far from secure, and Washington understood that the direction he set during his time in office would determine whether the United States would endure as a republic or collapse under the pressures of internal divisions and external threats. Washington's leadership was not just about managing crises, but about establishing the precedents that would guide future generations of Americans. The framework of government, the principles of democracy, and the role of the presidency were all in the process of being shaped during Washington's administration, and the decisions he made would resonate for years to come. One of the central questions facing Washington during this period was the question of precedent. How should a new government function, and how should its institutions be structured? Washington understood that, as the first president of the United States, he was in uncharted waters. There were no templates or models to follow, and the decisions he made would shape the presidency for decades, if not centuries, to come. His approach was one of caution and restraint, for he recognized the potential dangers of consolidating too much power in one branch of government, especially the executive branch. As much as Washington valued the strength of the presidency, he believed it was vital to ensure that the office did not become a monarchy, a fear that had driven much of the revolutionary struggle. One of Washington's most important actions in setting the tone for the presidency was his decision to establish the executive cabinet. Though not explicitly required by the Constitution, the cabinet became an essential part of the executive branch. Washington understood that he could not effectively govern alone, especially in a time of such complex challenges. He needed advisors who could offer expertise on specific issues and provide counsel on the various matters the government faced. Washington chose men of great talent and experience to fill the key positions of his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. The cabinet was meant to serve as a collective body, not just a collection of individuals, with each member contributing to the overall governance of the country. Washington's decision to work closely with his cabinet was a reflection of his belief in collaborative leadership, though he remained the ultimate decision-maker. As Washington worked to establish the infrastructure of the federal government, the question of the nation's economy loomed large. The United States was struggling with massive war debt, both from the Revolution and the subsequent period of economic instability. States had incurred their own debts, and the federal government had its share of financial obligations as well. The system of taxation was inadequate, and the country was at risk of financial ruin if something wasn't done quickly. It was in this context that Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, put forward his vision for the nation's economic future. Hamilton's financial program was bold and ambitious. His plan included the creation of a national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, the establishment of a system to manage national revenue, and the regulation of national credit. Hamilton argued that a strong federal government was essential for the nation's prosperity, and he believed that a well-managed financial system would strengthen the central government while creating a stable economy. He saw the national bank as a crucial step toward this goal, as it would serve as the central hub for managing the country's finances, regulating currency, and lending money to the government and businesses. Hamilton's plan, while visionary, was also controversial. Many Americans, especially those in rural areas, saw the creation of a national bank as an overreach of federal power. They argued that the Constitution did not explicitly grant the federal government the authority to create a bank, and they feared that it would concentrate too much power in the hands of the central government. Jefferson, who was staunchly opposed to Hamilton's financial vision, argued that the national bank was unconstitutional and that it would lead to the concentration of too much power in the hands of a few wealthy elites. Jefferson and his followers, the Democratic Republicans, believed in a more decentralized form of government, where power was distributed among the states and the people. They feared that Hamilton's plan would create a financial oligarchy, with the federal government wielding unchecked power over the nation's economy. The debate between Hamilton and Jefferson was not just a disagreement over policy. It was a clash of political philosophies. Hamilton believed in a strong federal government that could regulate commerce, finance, and foreign policy, while Jefferson believed that a more agrarian, decentralized society would best protect individual liberties and prevent the rise of tyranny. Washington, caught in the middle of this fierce ideological battle, ultimately sided with Hamilton. He understood that the country needed a stable financial system in order to thrive, and he believed that Hamilton's plan, though controversial, was the best way to achieve that goal. Washington's decision to support Hamilton's financial plan marked a critical moment in his presidency, as it set the stage for the creation of the nation's financial institutions and helped solidify the power of the federal government. The establishment of a national bank, along with other elements of Hamilton's financial program, would prove to be instrumental in stabilizing the nation's economy and securing its future. However, Hamilton's plan also deepened the divisions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, creating a rift that would define American politics for years to come. The rise of political factions, largely a result of the competing visions of Hamilton and Jefferson, began to threaten the stability of the nation. Washington, who had always been wary of political parties, became increasingly concerned about the impact of factionalism on the unity of the country. In his farewell address, Washington would famously warn against the dangers of political parties, believing that they would divide the nation and lead to unnecessary conflicts. While Washington was preoccupied with managing domestic issues, foreign policy was also a growing concern. The United States, despite its recent victory over Great Britain, was still a vulnerable nation caught between two powerful European powers, Britain and France. Both nations had significant interests in the Americas, and the United States found itself caught in the middle of their rivalry. France, still reeling from the French Revolution, was eager to draw the United States into an alliance, while Britain remained a powerful trading partner and a potential military threat. The question of whether the United States should align with France or Britain became a major issue in Washington's presidency. Hamilton, ever the realist, argued that the United States should align itself with Britain, which had long been a major trading partner. Jefferson, on the other hand, believed that the United States should honor its treaty with France and support the French Revolution. Washington, ever cautious, decided to remain neutral, recognizing that the United States was not strong enough to engage in a European war. He issued the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, which declared that the United States would not take sides in the conflict between France and Britain. The proclamation was controversial, particularly among those who sympathized with the French Revolution, but Washington believed it was the only course of action that could preserve American independence. The decision to remain neutral in the face of foreign conflicts marked a significant moment in Washington's presidency. It set a precedent for American foreign policy, one that emphasized the importance of avoiding entangling alliances and staying out of European conflicts. Washington's neutrality was not a rejection of foreign relations. Rather, it was a strategic decision to focus on the nation's internal development and avoid unnecessary military commitments. The Neutrality Proclamation helped to establish the United States as a nation that would pursue its own interests without being dragged into the rivalries and wars of Europe. Despite his efforts to maintain peace, Washington's presidency was marred by increasing political divisions and unrest. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion erupted in western Pennsylvania as farmers protested a federal tax on whiskey. The rebellion was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government, and Washington, determined to assert the power of the central government, responded by sending federal troops to suppress the uprising. The swift response to the Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated Washington's commitment to maintaining law and order, but it also highlighted the growing tensions between the federal government and the western frontier. As Washington continued to navigate the complexities of governing a new nation, his leadership was tested time and again. His decisions, though often difficult, laid the groundwork for the future of the United States. Washington's presidency, marked by his steady hand, his dedication to national unity, and his deep sense of duty, set important precedents for the office of the president and for the role of government in American life. His cautious approach to both domestic and foreign affairs allowed the country to grow and stabilize in its early years. But it also revealed the challenges of maintaining unity in a nation divided by political factions, regional interests, and conflicting visions of the future. Washington's legacy, though not without its struggles, would endure as one of the most defining periods in the history of the United States. As George Washington entered the final years of his presidency, the challenges he faced were as significant as those in his first term, but the context had shifted. The new government was becoming more stable, but it was far from secure. The question of what type of country the United States should become was still unresolved. Would it be a republic governed by reason and law, or would it succumb to the pressures of factionalism and partisan division? Washington, aware of the growing political divides, found himself grappling with forces that threatened the unity of the nation. By now, political factions had become entrenched, and the country's partisan divide was evident in the clear opposition between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. While Washington had initially hoped to avoid the formation of political parties, by the mid-1790s, the country had seen the emergence of a party system that was unavoidable. The differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were not just political. They represented fundamentally different visions for the future of the United States. Hamilton's Federalists believed in a strong, centralized government, a powerful economy driven by industry and commerce, and a closer relationship with Britain. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, championed a more agrarian society, a decentralized government, and an alliance with France, especially as the French Revolution had unfolded. Despite his personal reluctance, Washington had found himself aligning with many of the Federalist ideals, primarily because of his belief in the need for a strong central government to maintain national unity and financial stability. His presidency had been marked by a series of significant decisions that consolidated federal power, such as the establishment of the national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, and the implementation of a strong financial system. These decisions have been instrumental in stabilizing the country's economy, but they also deepened the divisions within the nation. Jefferson and his supporters viewed these actions as a betrayal of the democratic principles upon which the country had been founded. As Washington faced the bitter partisan struggles between Hamilton and Jefferson, he realized that the cohesion of the country rested on his ability to navigate these divisions. However, the rise of political parties also coincided with a wave of international challenges, particularly from Europe. In the early 1790s, the political situation in Europe was increasingly unstable, and the United States found itself caught between two major powers, Britain and France. The French Revolution, which had begun with the lofty ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, had descended into chaos, and the United States was torn between supporting its former ally, France, and maintaining good relations with Britain, its key trading partner. The outbreak of war between Britain and France in 1793 placed Washington in a difficult position. Both nations sought American support, but Washington was deeply wary of becoming entangled in European conflicts. His belief in American neutrality had already been articulated in his proclamation of neutrality earlier in his presidency, but the ongoing conflict in Europe raised new questions about how the United States should respond. Washington was committed to keeping the United States out of the war, but his decision to remain neutral was met with fierce opposition. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, wanted to honor the alliance with France and saw the United States as morally obligated to support the French Revolution. The Federalists, on the other hand, led by Hamilton, were more sympathetic to Britain, arguing that the U.S. needed to strengthen its relationship with the British to ensure economic stability. Despite the intense pressures from both sides, Washington remained steadfast in his commitment to neutrality. He believed that the United States was too weak to engage in a war and that the nation's survival depended on avoiding entanglements with foreign powers. He understood that the United States, while an independent nation, was still fragile and needed time to solidify its internal stability. Washington's decision was not merely a matter of policy, but of pragmatism. His leadership was driven by the recognition that the country's future was still uncertain and that it needed to be protected from external influences until it had matured as a republic. Washington's position was controversial, and it contributed to the growing political rift between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The French, who had been instrumental in securing American independence during the Revolutionary War, were particularly outraged by Washington's refusal to support their revolution. In response, they began seizing American ships that were trading with Britain, further escalating tensions. Despite these challenges, Washington held firm in his belief that neutrality was the best course of action for the United States. By 1794, the pressure on Washington to intervene in European conflicts grew, and his administration was confronted with increasingly divisive domestic issues. The Whiskey Rebellion, which erupted in 1794, posed one of the most serious internal challenges of Washington's presidency. The rebellion was sparked by a federal excise tax on whiskey, which had been implemented to help reduce the national debt. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, many of whom distilled whiskey as a means of income, saw the tax as an unjust burden. When protests erupted, Washington took swift action, deploying a militia to suppress the rebellion and asserting the authority of the federal government. The suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion was a defining moment for Washington, as it reinforced the strength of the federal government in the eyes of both supporters and critics. For the Federalists, it was a victory for law and order, while for the Democratic Republicans, it was a sign of Washington's increasing centralization of power. The Whiskey Rebellion was also an indication of the deepening divisions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. While the Federalists were largely concentrated in the urban and commercial centers of the country, Jefferson and his followers had the support of rural America, particularly in the southern and western states. The conflict over the whiskey tax reflected a broader struggle over the role of government and the distribution of power between the federal government and the states. Jefferson's opposition to the federal government's use of force to suppress the rebellion marked a growing rift between the two factions, and it set the stage for the political polarization that would dominate American politics for years to come. As Washington moved toward the end of his second term, his personal sense of duty continued to guide his actions, even as the nation became increasingly divided. Washington had long been weary of the growing political factions, and he was troubled by the possibility that political parties would permanently divide the nation. In his farewell address in 1796, Washington articulated his concerns about the dangers of political parties, warning that they could lead to factionalism, corruption, and the weakening of the nation's democratic institutions. He urged Americans to avoid entangling alliances with foreign powers and to prioritize unity above party loyalty. Washington's farewell address became one of the most important documents in American political history, serving as a guide for future leaders in maintaining national unity and avoiding the pitfalls of party politics. Washington's departure from the presidency in 1797 marked the end of an era in American politics. His leadership had shaped the country's early years, and his presidency set key precedents for future administrations. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms established the tradition of presidential term limits, which would remain in place until the 20th century. His retirement from public life was not just a personal decision, but a symbolic moment in the country's evolution. Washington's voluntary relinquishing of power was a reflection of his belief in Republican principles and his commitment to the idea that no one person should hold too much authority in a democracy. Washington's legacy, however, extended far beyond his time in office. His presidency had laid the groundwork for the United States as a stable republic, and his example of leadership set the tone for future presidents. Despite the partisan divisions and the challenges of his presidency, Washington had remained committed to the ideals of the American Revolution. He had fought not for personal glory, but for the principles of liberty, justice, and unity. His leadership had guided the United States through its formative years, and as he left the presidency, the nation was stronger, more unified, and more secure than it had been when he first took office. As Washington retired to his plantation at Mount Vernon, he did so knowing that the work of building the American Republic was far from finished. Yet his leadership had ensured that the United States had a solid foundation upon which to build. His departure from office, though marked by personal fatigue and the desire for peace, was also a testament to the strength of the republic he had helped create. In stepping down, Washington had shown that the presidency was not an office to be held indefinitely, but a position of service to the nation. His voluntary retirement became a model for future leaders, reinforcing the idea that power should not be concentrated in the hands of one individual for too long. Washington's presidency, though marked by challenges and divisions, had ultimately proven that democracy, though fragile, could endure if guided by principles of unity, restraint, and civic responsibility. As George Washington's presidency drew to a close, the nation he helped establish was at a crossroads. The United States had navigated its earliest years with a level of stability, but the future was far from certain. Washington's careful balancing act, steering the country through a volatile political climate, a shaky financial system, and a looming specter of foreign entanglements, had kept the fragile Union intact. Yet, the path forward remained unclear, especially as the factions within the country grew more entrenched. Washington's leadership was indispensable during this tumultuous time, but as his second term neared its end, he felt it was time to pass the torch to a new generation of leaders. The United States in the late 1790s was a nation that had established its independence, but was still in its infancy as a political entity. Although the government had been structured under the Constitution, the idea of a unified national identity was still fragile. Deep divisions existed not only along geographical and economic lines, but also in terms of political ideology. The emergence of political factions had become one of the defining features of the era, and it was an issue that Washington had been warning against for years. His own presidency had been marked by the conflict between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, headed by Thomas Jefferson. These parties, each with their distinct vision for the future of the United States, were not just political groups. They represented two conflicting worldviews. The Federalists, who were closely aligned with Hamilton, were advocates for a strong central government, an economy driven by commerce and industry, and closer ties with Great Britain. They believed in a robust federal system capable of regulating the economy, managing national debts, and maintaining a military force that could defend American interests. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans, who were led by Jefferson and his ally James Madison, championed states' rights, an agrarian economy, and a more limited role for the federal government. They believed that the future of the country lay in its rural landscapes, not in its burgeoning cities, and they feared that too much power at the federal level would erode the very freedoms the Revolution had sought to secure. This ideological division between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans marked one of the most contentious periods in early American politics. Washington, who initially hoped to avoid the formation of political parties, found himself increasingly drawn into the struggles between these two factions. He had always been more aligned with the Federalists, particularly Hamilton, with whom he shared a vision of a strong national government capable of ensuring the stability and growth of the United States. However, Washington's primary concern remained national unity, and he worried that the growing political divisions threatened to undermine the fragile republic. His farewell address in 1796 would become one of his most enduring legacies, a document in which he articulated his concerns about the future of the country. He famously warned the nation about the dangers of political parties, which he believed would divide the country and lead to factionalism. Washington feared that the rise of partisan interests would overshadow the common good and weaken the democratic system that had been painstakingly crafted. His address was also a call for neutrality in foreign affairs, as he cautioned against becoming entangled in the conflicts of Europe. Washington's advice to avoid entangling alliances reflected his broader vision of American independence and self-sufficiency, free from the influence of European powers. Despite his best efforts to avoid the deepening political polarization, Washington's presidency had inadvertently laid the groundwork for the party system that would dominate American politics for years to come. By the time he left office, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans had become entrenched political entities, each with its own set of supporters, ideologies, and goals. The political landscape was no longer just a question of governing effectively, but of managing the growing ideological divide that had emerged within the country. Washington's decision to retire from public life was, in part, his way of stepping away from these partisan struggles. But it was also an acknowledgement of his belief that the time had come for new leadership to guide the nation forward. The political factions that had taken shape under Washington's leadership were not merely a domestic issue. They also had important implications for American foreign policy. The United States found itself, once again, caught between two powerful nations, Britain and France. Both had been crucial to the success of the American Revolution, but both were also deeply involved in their own geopolitical struggles. The French Revolution had turned from a democratic uprising to a violent and radical conflict, and by the time Washington left office, the United States was in danger of being dragged into Europe's wars. In 1793, as war broke out between Britain and France, Washington issued his Neutrality Proclamation, which declared that the United States would not take sides in the conflict. This decision was highly controversial. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans were sympathetic to France, seeing the French Revolution as a continuation of the American struggle for liberty. They believed the United States had an obligation to support France, which had been an essential ally during the Revolution. The Federalists, on the other hand, led by Hamilton, saw Britain as a key economic partner and wanted to align with the British against the French. Washington, caught between these competing factions, decided that neutrality was the best course of action for the United States. He feared that involvement in European conflicts would only jeopardize the fragile stability the country had achieved. Washington's decision to remain neutral was tested repeatedly during his second term. In 1794, the British continued their policy of impressing American sailors into the British Navy, a practice that angered many Americans and threatened to drag the United States into war. Washington's government responded by negotiating the Jay Treaty, which sought to resolve these issues and improve relations with Britain. The treaty was highly unpopular with Jefferson and his allies, who saw it as a betrayal of France. However, Washington believed that the treaty was necessary to prevent war with Britain and to secure American trade rights. The Jay Treaty was a difficult decision for Washington, but reflected his pragmatic approach to foreign policy. Washington understood that the United States was not strong enough to engage in war with any European power, let alone both Britain and France. His decision to pursue a policy of neutrality and diplomacy, even when it was unpopular, demonstrated his commitment to the long-term survival of the Republic. Domestically, Washington's second term was also marked by the growing divisions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was a clear sign that the federal government's power was being challenged, especially by farmers in the western regions. They objected to the federal excise tax on whiskey, which they saw as an unfair burden. The rebellion was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government, and Washington responded decisively by sending federal troops to suppress the uprising. The swift and effective response to the Whiskey Rebellion was a clear message that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws. However, it also highlighted the increasing tensions between the central government and rural America, which would continue to play a role in the political landscape. Throughout his presidency, Washington had maintained a commitment to national unity, and his actions often reflected a desire to protect the fledgling republic from the forces of division. Yet by the end of his second term, he was deeply concerned about the growing polarization between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Washington's farewell address was, in part, an effort to prevent the country from descending into partisan conflict. He implored future generations to prioritize the common good over party loyalty and to avoid the dangers of political factionalism. Washington's decision to retire from public life after 2 terms was a monumental moment in American history. His voluntary departure from office set an important precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, a principle that would come to define the United States as a stable democracy. Washington's legacy was not just the creation of a new nation, but the establishment of democratic norms and practices that would guide future generations. As Washington left office, the nation was still fragile, and the political divisions that had emerged during his presidency were only beginning to take shape. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans would continue to battle for control of the country, and the question of how to balance federal power with states' rights would remain a central issue in American politics. Washington had steered the country through its formative years, but the work of building the United States was far from complete. Nonetheless, his leadership during the nation's first decade had laid the foundation for the future of the Republic. His vision of a united, independent, and self-sufficient nation would continue to guide the country as it moved into the 19th century. In retiring to Mount Vernon, Washington symbolized the ideals of republicanism he had fought for throughout his life. He stepped away not out of weariness or disillusionment, but because he believed that the strength of the Republic depended on the regular turnover of leadership. Washington's voluntary relinquishment of power underscored his belief in the importance of democratic principles and the necessity of institutionalizing the peaceful transfer of power. His departure from the presidency marked the end of an era, but his legacy endured, shaping the future of the United States for generations to come.